in my occasional walks through my neighborhood at night during this time of the year, I will encounter obviously homes that are extremely elaborately decorated, and with all sorts of lights and figurines and all sorts of things out there. And it's always an interest to me to try to get behind what one is thinking, because in many cases there's a lot of effort and expense even that's going into this. And frequently the themes of these displays are not related actually to the nativity. Okay, there'll be an occasional nativity scene there, but largely they're, Santa Clauses and elves and reindeer and all those things. Nothing wrong with that. But I'm wondering, what is the motivation for all this effort and expense over those particular images? And I guess there was a time in my life in ministry where I would have been a little bit critical of that. I'm not actually, because I kind of get a little bit of it. Because especially those homes where it's a little more simple and yet beautiful, where they just have the lights, maybe wrapped around the trees, and I find a fascination with that. I just sort of get drawn in very often to those decorations, and I think many people do. Otherwise, we wouldn't have such big deals like the Nights of Lights in St. Augustine, where people want to see that sort of thing. It's something that draws us in to that experience. There's something in all of that that is a little window for us into something inside of ourselves that we want to kind of look at today. What is it that creates that fascination for us about things like that? And there are many things in our world that can catch us for those moments that create that fascination and draw us in, and where for the moment it just seems like everything's right with the world. Just for that moment. Doesn't last normally, but it's there for those moments. This brought me to think about in my distant memory. When I was a kid, I really liked Christmas. I thought it was just really exciting, and I would get so excited about, especially when in those days when I believed the alternative truth about how the presents got there. Maybe when I was still debating about whether the alternate truth was true or not. But I'd be interested about, is the magic going to happen? Is the magic going to happen tonight? And as a result of that, I had difficulty with sleeping at night. Getting to sleep on Christmas Eve was always it took me a long time because I had all this excitement about it. I eventually get to sleep, and then I'll be usually the first one to wake up in the morning and kind of waiting around for everybody. But there was one year that I woke up. It had to be just in the early wee hours of the morning, and I thought I'd take the risk. And so I kind of got on my belly, and I'm crawling down the hallway toward the family room. And I get to the edge of the family room, and that's as far as I'm going to go, because there was something that was still sacrosanct about this space here. It's really not my place to be here right now. So I'm looking in from the edge. And I've had that experience of that being drawn in, of the fascination, of the desire, the longing that kind of got stirred in me. And it wasn't about there were a bunch of gifts around the tree now. So the magic had in fact happened. But that was not what captured me that night. It was actually just this whole scene. The tree was the only thing that was lit in the room. The beautiful lights on it, and the tinsel glistening, and the ornaments hanging there, and it just drew me in. It was something beautiful. I just lay there watching it for the longest time. And so it didn't lead me to kind of some sort of greed or excitement even. It was really more contentment, because at that moment, life was as it should be, it seemed. So it drew me in, that fascination with what was taking place, what was being displayed here. It was touching something deep in me. Now, we've all had, in different ways, experiences like that. And they're fleeting moments, as we said. The question is, are those real things, or are they some sort of a delusion or illusion? Because they don't seem to last. So is it just not real? Well, I want to propose to you tonight that actually those moments are the times in our life that are actually most real. That the rest of our life, driven by our ego, our false self, is covered over with all these illusions and delusions that keep us from actually seeing those real true moments that somehow still break through on occasion. They're the real thing. Now, C.S. Lewis, and people that have been around here for any length of time know I'm a big fan of C.S. Lewis, and he has something in his writing he calls the argument from desire. Now, he uses this principally to talk about the idea that God actually is, because there are these desires that are for something that we don't normally experience, but yet the fact that they're there is not a random thing, but it's actually the stirring in a kind of a spiritual DNA within us, a stirring for the thing that is real, that we used to have as humanity, that we fell from, that we somehow lost. And there are these occasions we break through the delusion and we experience the true thing. And that leads us to believe in the argument from desire that those are actually the real parts of our life. Now, when we look at that, when we look at desire and when you look at longing and fascination, we know that there are lots of things that human beings desire and long for that actually don't seem to be that good, don't seem to be good for us, may not be very good for making us healthy, whole people at all. And so are those desires then wrong? Well, let's take look at just a few for an example. Let's take an addiction, any addiction that you choose. Well, there's a longing and there's a desire for something that comes to the point where it's sort of out of our control. And yes, but it's a longing and a desire. Is that a bad thing? Well, yeah, the way it manifests itself is harmful to us. But what the desire actually is speaking to, that deepest part of ourselves and the DNA part of us, is actually about us desiring and longing for happiness and joy. And through this delusion, we go about it in all the wrong ways. We all know that sex is a very, very powerful thing too. And it's easy enough to get off the rail with that as well. There's longing and desires that can get us into all sorts of places. And so is that a bad thing? Well, those manifestations may be, but the longing and desire is actually touching something that is very real, that is deep within us, as part of the spiritual DNA. And that is to have intimacy with someone else. Smother love is another thing that we see as well, where there's, this being covered over with this grasping at this other person and smothering them with our love, so to speak. Is that wrong? Well, it is in that manifestation, but it's actually speaking to something much deeper, a real desire to be connected. And so that's really what these episodes in our life begin to do for us, is open us to the truth that's there all the time. It's not like it's lost. It's in the background. It's behind the scenes. And we can only glimpse it sometimes and momentarily, it seems. But again, it's there. And it's real. And it's powerful. And so ultimately, these longings, these desires, and this fascination actually are a longing for God. We're in God, we have this pristine and perfect relationship with God. And so really what we're looking at as Christians, how does that make sense of everything else? Well, it begins to put everything else in order. If we get that piece right, and that in order, then it begins to flow into all these other aspects of our lives, so it's not ending up in addiction or sex off the rail or smother love, but rather the real thing begins to be manifested in us. And it flows from that relationship outward. I like to use the example of a bicycle tire. You've got all these spokes there, and then you've got a hub at the middle. Now, if you take the hub away, you have these spokes, and these can be all these different parts of our life and these desires and longings. But if you take the hub away, they just get all tangled up, and the thing goes nowhere. It just collapses on itself. That's how most of us live our lives. That sort of collapsing experience. But if you get the hub in there and you hook everything up to it, then you've got something that works properly and will get us to where we need to go. St. Augustine said something very interesting about this. He said, as he's praying to God, he says, "You have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you." That says it all about that longing. We can get that part right, all of it begins to come together and start making some sense. We have the idea of the God-shaped hole, that we keep trying to plug other things in there instead of the real thing, and that's God, and therefore we always find ourselves disappointed. Our longings and desire and fascination dashed. Okay, so that's all interesting, right? What does that have to do with the incarnation? Well, that's what we're here for, right? And talk about Christmas, the incarnation of God in Christ. So I want to give you an illustration. I'll tell a story that kind of helps us, I think, get a little closer to see how these desires work themselves out in these little wonderful intrusions of enlightenment that break through for us. One of the sort of small genres in literature has to do with stories where you have twins that somehow get separated somewhere along, usually very early in life, right? There are several stories like this. One that everybody knows about is a Star Wars story, right? Princess Leia and Luke Skywalker don't know it, but they're actually twins that were separated way back then, and part of the discovery of who they are, the real power that they have, and the moral authority and spiritual authority has to do with that discovery of one another. There's a Prince and the Pauper. Mark Twain has a story that's like that too, one that falls from royalty and is a pauper, and yet he is rediscovered with his twin. The one story I like the best in all of that genre is C.S. Lewis again, in his Chronicles of Narnia, A Horse and His Boy. Well, we have these two brothers that were separated at birth, and one ends up being truly a pauper. He ends up in another country. He ends up very, very poor. He ends up with a very abusive father, no mother in the household, and it's just a miserable life, where his brother still is there with the father and with the family and living that life as a prince, living it as he was born into it. The other's not. And so the stories kind of go this way, that they start with this separation, and the lost twin doesn't know who they really are. They have no clue. They think this situation right here is me. And yet, even in that, we see in those stories, there's little breakthroughs that we're talking about, these little glimpses that actually happen along the way. And usually it's other people that may notice that, where things that they're unaware of in themselves. There's something, a way about them that sometimes is just a little bit different than everybody else in that particular station and situation. Or maybe they have a particular carriage about them that seems to be at times a little bit more royal, and where in the world did they ever learn anything like that? Or maybe there's a particular call on their life that we see unfolding, and it's easiest for us to see it outside than they can see within it. In A Horse and His Boy, actually the way this manifests, there is a call that creates a situation where the pauper twin ends up being exiled in infancy because there was a clear call, a prophecy that said that he would be the one when he grew up that would save all of the country, save all of Narnia. And his uncle that wanted to take authority arranged for him to be stolen and end up in this particular circumstance. And then we see the whole story, these episodes that seem horrible to this child at the time. horrible. Just everything is going wrong, and every piece of it is a part of the call and the unfolding of that child getting back and finding his twin and finding his family and finding his place, his true self. So having been discovered again, the way they discover it, you know how the story runs. It's they recognize, I look like you and you look like me. And then begins the unfolding, the revelation that this really is the lost twin. And that lost twin never knew it until face to face with the princely twin. Once they begin this recovery, it's not instantaneous. They have to learn how to be a prince. You have to learn how to be a princess. But they learn it fast, they learn it well. And they find themselves living into the fullness of the call, the true self that they are. I hope you're beginning to see how this fits in with Jesus, the incarnation. When we talk about Jesus and the incarnation, we often, we talk about, oh, come let us adore him, or worshiping Jesus. You know what, something, if you read the Gospels, this may surprise you, but if you read it through, Jesus never, ever said to anybody, worship me. Ever. What he did say repeatedly was follow me. If you really understand the incarnation, what's happening is that we have the human being, Jesus of Nazareth, being indwelt by Christ, the eternal Christ, the cosmic Christ, with the second person of the Trinity, with God the Father forever and ever, for eternity. And they come together in this one perfect and pristine person. Now, what the news is about this is that's not a one-off deal. It's not that that happens to Jesus and bully for Jesus, because if that's all it is, it doesn't really help us too much. Something is a nice fascination, it's a nice curiosity, but it doesn't help us any. It would not be a plan or a strategy for actually being renewed and restored and transformed and becoming like Christ. We become like Christ because he's the example of what it looks like. He's the twin that was always with the Father, that never became the pauper, never failed to know who he was. We see him come, and we begin to see as the lost twin what it is we're supposed to be. We see ourselves potentially in him. That's what we look like. And when we see it, when we begin to enter into it, we're drawn in, and all those little occasions that are broken through begin to make sense. That's where my longing is. That's where my desire is. That's where my fascination is to be like that. And so the incarnation brings us face to face with the opportunity for that kind of transformation. It's a brilliant thing. And so when we come to this occasion of Christmas, we're looking at the incarnation as a revelation, a Spirit-empowered roadmap of how we get back home. And it's by following him, who is who we're to look like, who we will look like. So to me, if we want to talk about real fascination, this is the most fascinating thing I can think of. The incarnation has happened, and we see who we truly are. That should draw us in every day, deeper and deeper, to who you and I actually are. So with that, have a very Merry Christmas, and one that's truly special as we honor Christ in the image of ourselves in him. Amen.